Well, if I fall asleep on you this morning, it's because we took a little vacation last week. As soon as I finished teaching here, hurried home, we got in the car, and we started driving to Gulf Shores, Alabama, and we spent the week. And along the way, before we took off, Karen decided we needed another day, which meant 6 o'clock yesterday morning, we got up, hurried, finished loading the car, got on the road, and 15 hours later, we're pulling in at home, 11 o'clock last night. And so then unloaded and got ready to come. And so, anyway, I worked while I was on vacation, and but I didn't review it this morning, so it's. I hope it hasn't gone cold. But basically, where we left off was with the view of several of Old Testament scholars seeing Genesis not only as an explanation of a theory of creation in itself, but rather it's really an introduction to a salvation history of the children of Israel. And in that sense, it has the character of an introduction of the God who saved you from Pharaoh to the audience of this story. The God who saves is the Creator, the Lord of history. And so that's why Genesis is written, because it's that prelude to the rest of the story. It was not just created in order to tell a creation story and be freestanding out here. It takes its significance and its purpose as the introduction of that longer story. So a part of the shape of the story is trying to set the stage for other things in the rest of the story. So, when our God began creating heaven and earth, that is the known world to the people of Israel, they would look around, and what would they see? They would see the heavens, and they would look around on the ground and off to the hills, and they would see earth. But it was the known world. And so the ancient Hebrew could see formless and void wasteland, unproductive chaos, strong and powerful wind was blowing over all of this, and in that sense churning and stirring up the dark, empty deep, which was the sea in that sense, and also a part of the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth, has a lot to do with sea. But the ancient Hebrew author, the priestly author in Genesis 1, was not thinking in terms of analytical precision of the Greek thought forms, of a prime, unmoved mover, but and not thinking in abstractions, but it's a God who is in relationship with the world and with the Hebrew people. So we know God by what God does and how God operates within history. And that's the kind of God that he is trying to explain through the creation story as the beginning. And first, that we note as we compare this to the other creation stories in the Middle East at the time, is that God is not a part of nature. God stands above nature and outside of nature, operating on nature. And that is a powerful difference that the first listeners to this would notice. We don't, because we aren't inundated by all of that other. We've grown up with this, so this kind of seems the natural part. But God is above nature. So rather than in the sense of the passage that we're dealing with right at the first, that God, rather than a spirit hovering or brooding over creation, and then in the beginning of creation infusing spirit into that creation. That's really not in the mind of the priestly author, one of the main scholars, but a couple of scholars are noting that the first act of creation, as I said, is not an infusion of this divine spirit that was floating around, as some have tried to interpret it, but rather God speaks. God speaks. And this is from the outside imposing order to all of this disorder. And in the Semitic world, word and deed are very strongly tied together almost as one. Blessings, curses, prophetic pronouncements have efficacy. The word makes things happen. It brings them about. So this is the way it works. And then, so let me get in here. So I was just reviewing in the beginning when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. And, some say hovering, brooding, but it was sweeping, it was churning. And then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness, and God called the light day, and the darkness He called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. So that's where we are. We're at the first day. So one of the scholars says, calling it good is not so much an aesthetic, like it's good, it's beautiful, it's pretty, it's nice, is not what that Hebrew author is thinking. When everything is formless and void and a wasteland is given, that's not good. If it was okay, God leave it alone. But God is changing it because it's not good and going to make it good, make it better. So in making it better, it begins to take on function and purpose. So as we read, as God creates something, then we hear a purpose for it. And a part of the main purpose is order out of the chaos, but within the order, things all have a purpose and a function. So we're looking for, what is God's purpose and function in creating things this way? And as we move on and find God creating, in this story, the human being as the pinnacle of creation, the creation that God has a very special relationship with, then purpose and function are kind of all related to what is our purpose and function within this system that God created and placed us into. So then that's kind of the beginning, and so then we get rules and laws and guidelines and have a sense of purpose. What does God want from us? And we'll get to that later. But anyway, let there be light. So here's a question. Why is light first? Again, for purpose. What's it for? So you can see, yes, so we can begin to see and see what God is doing and find our way in this world as things begin. But some people will notice, don't we need the sun, the moon, the stars first as a source of light? I mean, in our scientific modern orientation, we have something happening and we know cause and effect. Well, there's light. Well, what caused the light? Well, God just said, let there be, but so much of things we know. When we go into our house and we want light, and it's night, what do? We don't just say, let there be light. Although nowadays some have got these little clap things and lights come on. But most of us look for the switch. And there's a source, a light bulb. So some will begin to think, Well, for there to be light, there has to be sun and moon and stars, and those don't get created till later. So that raises some conundrum. But in ancient world and Near Eastern cosmologies, the sun and the moon and the stars are deities. And so there's a statement, a powerful statement by neglect. We don't spend the first day creating light and then involving the sun, who happens to be another culture's god. We diminish the significance of their god by not mentioning the sun for quite a while. And anyway, so that's one of what we think is one of the motivations of the priestly offer. And we, again, I think I've said it a couple of times, so much of this, we don't know the history of the ancient Near East, but that is the context. And so much of why this is written the way it is, it's an over and against. It's standing in stark opposition to what people are already hearing and have heard. The Amunah Elish creation narrative, they think maybe 1,200 years it had been told and retold and then got written. It was a powerful part of the culture. And this is standing over and against it. It's just to say I've got a different way of viewing the world and seeing things and understanding who God is and what God is doing. So we have the ancient priestly author is trying to diminish the other gods, so he doesn't want to even make any allusion to them. But more importantly, he's trying to say this is our story, and I'm going to tell it our way. And don't get it confused with the others. Also, the priestly author is insisting that light, like everything else, is good in man's world, and it is a creature of God. Again, not a deity of its own, not one of the lesser gods to be worshipped, but created by God and not from some other source or other God. It's our God who gives it to us. And it is first, since it is a condition of everything else in God's creation, all of which must be deeds that we can see in the light and understand. And so light, as you said, enables vision, and man can see reality. And reality then becomes God's truth as revealed to us. We have the expression enlightened. And that's a part of this. This story is to enlighten us, to let us know and understand. So, right at the beginning, the first thing is kind of saying that I want you to see how things came about. And so God creates light. And so God is the gift of truth and reality that you will get a new vision, a new way of understanding and seeing. Also, the other part is, it's not from the world of darkness and evil and mystery. That was in that primordial mix of goo and turbulence and chaos. God's goodness doesn't come from that mix. It comes from God from another place. And so God saw how good the light was, and God calls it good. So then we get to another part that so often is not mentioned and lifted up. We just think of God as creating, but another big part of God's creation is separation. It's an act of ordering. Have you ever organized stuff that's all in a mess? Have you ever gotten one of these books that says how to organize your life? or read an article how to organize your life. And if we're going to do it, if you're really going to clean out that garage and that closet and that attic, they say separate things into 3 piles. Things that are important and I'm going to keep. Things that are good, but I can't use anymore, and I'm going to give them away. And then that 3rd pile, this is just complete trash and rubbish and needs to go to the recycle or to the dump or somewhere else. But you're organizing by separating. Separating things and putting them in their proper place. So, God begins in this creation story the acts of separation, and He separates the light from the darkness, and it's this act of bringing order into the world. And then God separates light from darkness and calls the light day and the darkness night. Evening came, and then morning the first day. Well, this order begins a process of history. What is history but a string of days where things happen, one after the other, one after the other? This is the beginning of a timeline. Now, time is an abstract thought. Here's one. Do we pass through time as people living our lives? Or does time pass us by? Are we stationary and the time is moving? Or is time stationary and we move through it? Or is time linear? Just one day after another, after another, after another, ad infinitum, or is it cyclical? We get up in the morning, we go through our routines, we go to bed, we go to sleep, we get up in the morning, we go through our routines, we go to bed, we go to sleep, we go through spring, summer, fall, winter, spring, summer, fall, winter. Yeah, it's organic, but it's cyclical. It's repetitious. So, is it one way or the other? Or is it all of these? These are just different ways of experiencing and visualizing and organizing in our minds what time is and how it works. Well, this has a theological dimension to it as we think about time. It is God who created time when God created us. And time in God's world and purpose has special functions that we need to learn. And so we have time, and so part of that ordering is that God's role in creation and history and creating us and so forth has a strong historical dimension to it that we will learn, because God is involved in guiding and leading history, not just this. You've heard of the clockmaker idea of God, when people are trying to think of, who is God, where is God, how is God, who made God, and all those philosophical and abstract thoughts. Said, well, God is a creator, but God just created it all and wound it up like a clock and then set it over here and let it start running, and then God went away and went to sleep, and God's not involved. Anybody heard that clock in or Philosophy 1 in college or something? Anyway, some of you are nodding yes, the clockmaker God. Well, this is not that. This God is going to be involved, intimately involved in the lives of people, and this special people, but how is that going to happen? We learn later, but right now it's beginning to set the stage. This God is going to be involved. But notice it also does not say with a new dawn, morning, day, in evening and night, but the new day begins with evening, Why in the Jewish religion? Well, Sabbath time orientation and demarcation is a new day begins when the sun goes down. That's why in the Jewish tradition, Sabbath, their Sabbath, doesn't begin Saturday morning. It's our Friday night after sundown. But that's the line of demarcation of when the new day begins. Evening comes, and then morning. So that would be really interesting. This will be your homework. Try to spend all next week operating as if the new day begins when the sun goes down. It is. That's not the way we think about time, the way we organize our time. But anyway, it's arbitrary. We can do it. You can do it if you want. Or maybe if you try. But anyway, so that would be an interesting experiment. And if any of you do, report how it felt. Okay, so the new beginning. So creation is an order of things, and the creation creates history, as I said, ordering of time. Now, when we get to the Sabbath rest, that's going to be very important. But the light had been pronounced good, but not the night. In the pronunciation of the goodness, it didn't include night. Where God looked at day and night, light and darkness, and thought, well, it's good to have both. In the pronouncing of the goodness, only the light is given that blessing of goodness. So that's an important distinction that the ancient mind would understand and take note of. You didn't bless. I mean, it's kind of like, if you have grandchildren come visit, or little kids, and you have a present and there's two of them, you have a present for one and not the other. That's going to be noticed. So in this case, where God blesses the day and ignores the night, that's a powerful, powerful statement by that neglect. So I had a vision coming home. I was driving most of the time, and we were driving through this one little area, and there was this town, and I first caught sight on this side of the highway, one of those little jumping Jupiter things, and there were like 4 or 5 kids playing on it. And then just as I glanced, I saw on the other side of the highway, there was a little park, and there was an extra big Jupiter and a picnic, and about 40 or 50 people having a party over there. And I got to wondering, why are they separated? I don't know, but we got to thinking, these kids over here knew about that party over there, and they weren't invited. I was thinking, Mom and Daddy thought, that's not fair. I don't want our kids sitting at home watching them across the highway having this big party, not invited. We'll get our own Jupiter, and we'll invite a few kids, and we'll just have our own party. I have no idea whether that is what really was going on or not, but you wonder, why is this happening at the same time? And one's a big one and one's a little one. Well, anyway, those kind of distinctions happen as cultures and groups of people are rubbing up against each other and trying to establish whose ideas, whose values are more important in this culture. And we make them known by who we invite to parties and who we don't invite to parties. And so, anyway, some of that is going on here. So, anyway, the light's pronounced good, night is not. The separation thing, if we understand that when God began to create heaven and earth, the earth was a formless wasteland and a deep, and the dark and the empty waters were the chaos over which God would exercise His creative power and will to bring order and goodness, then that's the area where the human beings are going to find their life is in the light and not down in the darkness. And in the priestly view, this separation of light which God creates from the darkness, which was pre-existing, if we look at it from their primitive view, is God taking control over. Now, God creates the light and calls it good, but again, back to ignoring the darkness, that was already there. And so God's not going to be calling it good, because that's what needs fixing. In the priestly view, this separation of light created from the darkness is again this statement. In Semitic culture, in the Middle Eastern world, this way of taking control, the separating theme, is a dominating and taking possession of. And then the next part, naming day and night, is another part of taking control. When we name things, there's an element of taking control, if only in our own minds and organizing things. But when we give names to things, in a sense, we define who they are and what they are for us. And if we're in relationship with them, we begin to define who they are in their existence. Sometimes we have that power. Now, if I am a ruler and I'm going to designate my subjects, you are gardener, you are doorman, you are soldier, you are garbage collector. You know, I define who you are and what you do because I'm the ruler. I'm in charge. I'm in control. So this element of God naming is a strong symbol of that taking control and setting the stage. Now, one of the things that as I was reflecting on this, I got to think, what is the message for us today? I mean, this ancient stuff. And one of the things that came to mind as we read this and reread it again, when we have a world now with so much conflict and war and the drug culture and the violence in our community, so many shootings and death, and people in high power cannot behave themselves and get caught and they get in trouble. Sometimes it's personal and selfish, and sometimes it's misdirected. But whatever it is, as we step back, we don't think it's good. And sometimes it looks like, what's the world coming to? But as we read this story, it says, evil is not uncontrollable. Evil can be controlled. It can be made, it's a struggle, but it can be controlled. And evil is not the most powerful thing in the world. Those powerful forces in the beginning, the chaos, in the dark and the deep, God tamed them and dominated them and gave them names. And so as we begin to work through these, then God is going to put human beings in charge of trying to maintain the order. And it goes on and on and on in a cyclical way. It gets better and it gets worse and it gets better and it gets worse. But it's us people, God's people, who are given that, will be given that role and that job to maintain the order. But in order to do that, we've got to figure out, how did God make it and how does God want it to be? And that's, again, part of the message here. Now, the next day begins with, oh, wait a minute. Are any questions about that day and the light? Yes?
You mentioned that God created light first.
Mm-hmm.
Could it be that Jesus Christ said that he was with God before the creation? Jesus also said, I am the light of the world. Could this have been God establishing Jesus Christ at the very beginning of creation?
There is a strong group of theological reflection in Christianity that deals with the theme, the pre-existence of Christ, that deals with these speculations of the Old Testament creation story and the Christian reading of our understanding of Christ as Son of God, and in the Greek influence upon the early church in the first centuries as they tried to work out the theological questions and issues. It's a really fun word that they came up with, dealing with the problem of the Hebrew tradition of one God, and yet we've got Father, Son, Holy Spirit, which then being Trinity. Then, but how can the three be one in this conundrum? They came up with the word homoousios. Homo one, ousios, of the same substance. Anyway, it's a fun word to say. It just kind of rolls off the tongue, but it's a part of the mystery of God. And I think the only reason that Christianity holds on to it, other religions like the Unitarians try to rationalize it out, and they just kind of rationalized it and threw it away. That's why they're Unitarians. You know, they says that puzzle can't be solved. But I think one of the main reasons Christianity holds on to that is because it reminds us we can never fully get our minds wrapped around God and control God with our intellect. So a part of that process of trying to learn the best we can within that challenging concept is, where is Christ? When did Christ originate? Because we have him being born and being sent and not being really talked about earlier, but as a revelation for Christianity. So, a lot of New Testament or Christian scholars really have to wrestle with that. And one of those schools of thoughts deals with pre-existence of Christ and comes up with those concepts of the light and the beginning and that sort of thing. But it can't be solved. It's just part of the conundrum that we figure out as best we can understand for ourselves and our faith, and just says, well, I think this is what it is. I'm going to go with that. But I can't prove it. And so that's where we try to do, is just get to that point of what do we get comfortable with, that we can live with within our own faith journey, and then go with that. But the Hebrew writer isn't speculating about that Messiah yet. We don't even have the Hebrew people coming into being for whom a Messiah is to be the leader. So this is kind of way before then. Okay, so any other questions? Okay. The third day, we get, and then God said, "Let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." So God made the dome and separated the waters that were under the dome from the waters that were above the dome, and so it was. God called the dome sky, and there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. Did this one forget something? Did God call it good or bad? See, God spoke, and God called the dome sky, but God didn't. We don't have in this one God calling it good. We don't have a pronouncement of the blessing. It says He was pleased. Which version is that? That has that one? Okay. New Revised. Well, they tried to add that. Actually, the second day we just have the separation, and we move on down to the other part we get, but at that point, the ancient texts don't have the calling of that good, because again the waters were a part of that primordial part that God is bringing under control, and so the separating is what God is doing, but not creating the waters. Now we have the dome. Do you all understand the vision of the primitive folks, that this dome that they are envisioning is solid? Have you encountered that? In that it's a use of the word is like hammering out a big dish, and the idea of that's what's holding the waters back and separating them. That we have within. I've been up north when it's been cold in wintertime and very thick snow, and if you have ski poles and you punch a hole down and you look down the hole, it turns blue. And so they're looking up, seeing water that's blue here and blue up there, and then periodically water falls out of there. They had the idea of that's being held up, and they had the expression floodgates opening, that something would open and let that water fall out. So this is a prerequisite separating in order to create the possibility for the earth or the land, and then it will be called good after we tame the waters. Now, the older concept of God making and fashioning, which we find in this second story of the Adam and Eve, that very hands-on understanding of God, we get a little bit of that with the word of the tapping or the hammering of the dome with the words, ancient Hebrew words that are used there. a craftsman-like putting things together. So, but this is a kind of blending of those concepts that are still operating at the same time that the priestly writer is trying to craft his story. But God made these and separated them. Now, this three-storied universe, they had the dome was up high, and that was the heaven and the sky, and then the earth was in the middle, and then they had an underworld that they viewed as being what was underneath the ground, and they had ideas of waters under the ground and so forth. Now, in the next day, beginning at the 9th, and God said, "Let the waters under the sky be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together He called seas, and God saw that it was good. And that's where He pronounces the goodness. And then God said, "Let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees of every kind on earth that bear fruit and with seed." And it was so. And the earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed of every kind, and trees of every kind bearing fruit with seed in it. And God saw it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. So, God got really busy on the third day, made a lot of stuff happen. And one of the thoughts that one of the scholars pointed out is that there may have been a prior ordering of days and story that the ancient priestly writer was dealing with that really just assumed that when the dry lands were brought forth, that with them came all of the vegetation. But the priestly writer wasn't satisfied with that and wanted the understanding that God provided the sustenance for people, because He specifically mentions the plants with seeds, which means barley and wheat that get made into bread for human beings, and the fruit, apples and oranges and so forth, that humans need for their diet and to be fed. Those expressions are very much the human diet that God is especially creating. So it's setting this stage, setting it up for human beings. He didn't go through like the 104th Psalm has a kind of a creation story where everything has its place. In this one, human beings will be the pinnacle of creation, the final thing, God's purpose in making all of this move along. But in the 104th Psalm, it just, everything has its place, and everything is equal, and human beings are a part of that, but all creation has its purpose, and it's another expression of this. But there is no more naming here, because God has separated and brought under control this pre-existing chaos and wasteland. It's formless and void, and He gives order to it. And but He names earth and sea, exercising dominion over them, and but He doesn't name all of the different kinds of fruit. And this vegetation, again, is this anthropocentric, or centered on man and human needs. Now, there are these two events on the third day, as I said, may indicate this act of providing and establishing these qualities of the earth to support human beings. So another aspect of sea is a demythologizing the word sea, because in some religions they made that a deity, and so again it's over and against that concept. Have you all heard the Emunah Elish story? Are you familiar with it? Yeah, it's all of those guys. Well, in the last few minutes, let me give you this synopsis, because this is so critical to the background of what's in the culture and in the world and the role and function. So, anyway, this Emunah Elish, E-N-E, well, there it is. If you want to look it up, it's quite long. They're like, I think, 7 big tablets of the story. Anyway, this Babylonian creation epic tells how before the formation of heaven and earth, nothing existed except deep water, and this primordial generative element was identified with Apsu, the male personification of the primeval sweetwater ocean, with his female associate Tiamat. The primordial saltwater ocean represented a ferocious monster. From the commingling of the two waters were born the divine offspring. These in turn gave birth to a second generation of gods, and the process was repeated successively. Then came a time when the young gods, through their unremitting and noisy revelry, playing their loud music and driving their cars up and down the streets, they disturbed the peace of Tiamat and Apsu, and later decided to destroy the gods. See, that's one of the things about other gods. They had no morality. I mean, they were just awful people all around, or gods all around. But the evil design was thwarted by the quick action of the all-wise Ea, the earth-water god. Tiamat now planned revenge and organizing her forces for the attack on the other gods. The latter, for their part, requested Marduk to lead them in the battle, and he acceded provided that he be granted sovereignty over the universe. To this condition the assembly of gods readily agreed, and Marduk, invested with the insignia of royalty, thereupon became their champion and took upon the cudgels against Tiamat and her helpers. After a fierce battle in which he defeated the enemy forces and slew Tiamat, Marduk sliced the carcass of the monster in two and created one half the firmament of heaven and the other the foundation of the earth. The work of creation having thus begun, Marduk then established the heavenly luminaries, each in its place. This activity is described in the 5th tablet of the epic, which unfortunately is fragmentary. However, from what follows, it would appear that gods complained to Marduk that each having now been assigned his or her fixed place and function in the cosmos, there would be no relief from unending toil. Accordingly, Marduk decided to create man to free the gods from their menial labor, and this he proceeded to do, fashioning a human being out of the blood of Kingu, Tiamat's second husband and captain of her army. The gods showed their gratitude to Marduk by building for him a great shrine in the city of Babylon, the gate of God. The epic ends with a description of a testimonial banquet tendered by the gods, at which they recite an adulation hymn of praise to Marduk that confirms his kingship for all eternity. Now, the function of their myth gave a structure to the world and kind of set up a concept of human beings were to be the slaves of the gods, but once their Babylonian world got established with their own kings and forces, this myth was used to justify their work, and then made all their subjects to be slaves to the state and to them. So that story is the over and againstness of our creation story, seeing that those descriptions of the gods and particularly the place of human beings in when we get to the creation of human beings as the pinnacle of creation, in contrast to an afterthought to be the slaves of the gods, then this is a powerful difference that's made. Any last questions? I think we're getting close to having our hour completed, and we've got folks wandering in getting ready for the next service. So, did Muzan end with a prayer, or he just said, we're done and go away? Oh, started with a prayer. Well, let's end with a prayer. Oh, okay. Okay. Well, let us pray. Well, dear God, we thank you for all the ways that you have been with your people, helping them feel your love, experiencing the light, the enlightenment, the understanding, the revelation of who you are in relation to us, as our God, as our guide, as our Savior, as the one who wants the best for us by creating this wonderful earth, but also giving us the guidance and direction to take care of this earth and our earth companions. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Okay, we'll move ahead and deal with the stars and the suns and the lights and all those things that get stuck up there